Let me ask a kind of dumb bunny question, if I might. In my state of Vermont, the Census Bureau recently reported that family income has declined by 7% over the last 2 years. And throughout the country, I think people are working longer hours for lower wages. Real wages are lower now than they were 20 years ago and so forth. And if somebody in my state or any place in the country picks up the paper today and they say, let's see, United States, we don't have health care for our people. We can't afford to send kids to college. We've cut Medicare by $115 billion. But gee, that's a good thing. We do have $3 billion in contingency funds for the bailout of Indonesia. And on top of that, we are putting substantial sums of money at risk through the IMF and the World Bank. We've got money to do that. And lo and behold, the government that we are bailing out is run by a dictator, authoritarian society. Forbes magazine says that this guy himself is worth $16 billion. Estimates are that his family is worth $30 billion. And estimates are that his cronies, 50 cronies or so that I've heard, are worth another $30 billion. So you got 50 or 60 people in a poor country who are worth $60 billion. And the United States government is there aggressively to help bail them out, but my farmers in the state of Vermont are going under. Workers are seeing decline in their standard of living. 40 million Americans have no health insurance, no money available. But for a handful of crooks who have $60 billion amongst them in a poor country, hey, we are there and moving vigorously. Now, that's a dumb bunny question that 1 or 2 Americans might ask, and I'm sure we have sophisticated answers to tell us why we're wrong. But Mr. Levinson, would you want to comment on maybe that question?
Well, firstly, I don't think you're wrong. You've got a complete imbalance in this whole system. $50 billion for Mexico was mobilized internationally. 30 billion, I guess it's 40 billion now for Indonesia. 17 billion for Thailand. So we're at 107 billion. We just heard that may need as much as 80 billion for Korea. And these numbers are thrown around that they can be mobilized, and it's cast in terms of saving, quote, the system. But for ordinary working people, the system ain't so good. And it's not throwing off the benefits that they see others are reaping. After all, Jack Welch of GE, wages at GE have been stagnant. His last number I saw was $27 million in benefits. So people begin to say, well, listen, what system are we saving? And that goes to Congressman Frank's point. Where's the equity in it? Where's the balance? And that's all that any of us asked in the fast track debate. I don't want to keep coming back to fast track, but in the end, what we said was, is this system going to have a minimum element of balance? Right. Their answer has been no.
All right, let me ask my other friends up here, the other gentlemen, does anybody have any qualms about using taxpayer dollars to bail out a corrupt military dictatorship? Please, anybody who would like to answer?
I'd like to answer, because I don't think that characterization is either accurate or helpful. Your farmers in Vermont, Mr. Sanders, will be worse off if Indonesia goes through a financial crisis that has the kind of effects that I described before. Your workers will be worse off. The money that the U.S. puts into the IMF or these packages comes back with full interest. It makes money for the U.S. taxpayer. It doesn't cost it. If we don't do it, whatever you believe are the equities, whether Jack Welch ought to pick it up, whether Suharto's daughter ought to pick it up, the real fact is that if we don't play the kind of role we have, your farmers in Vermont are worse off,
Okay,
period.
if I could have the mic back. And I'm quite familiar with the trickle-down theory that we have to help the very rich.
No trickle-down.
Let me finish. You said that I mischaracterized the regime. Let me quote from the U.S. State Department's annual Human Rights Report for 1996, and I quote, "Despite a surface adherence to democratic forms, the Indonesian political system remains strongly authoritarian. The government is dominated by an elite comprising President Suharto, his close associates, and the military." I can go on. Do you disagree with that characterization?
I did not say you mischaracterized the Indonesian regime. I was talking about the global economic system and what in practical terms will hurt or help your farmers in Vermont.
Right.
I can come up with better ways to solve the problem.
My farmers in Vermont are honest people who work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they get very little help from the government. And farmers in Vermont and workers throughout this country, as Mr. Levinson mentioned, do wonder that at a time when Medicare is cut, when Medicaid has been cut, when we cut back programs for low-income kids because there's no money available for those needs, why suddenly there's money available. And your thesis is, as is usually the thesis that we hear from representatives of big business, is that we got to prop up the wealthy and the powerful because in the long run, let me finish. In the long run, it's going to really help everybody.
No,
and the fact that the rich today, the richest 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90%, the fact that the CEOs make 200 times more than their workers, in some magical way, it's all going to come down. But I think, as Mr. Frank, Mr. Levinson indicated, not everybody accepts that line. I'd give it back to you, sir.
You have mischaracterized my thesis. I never said you should defend the wealthy. I said, now the third time, your workers in Vermont will be worse off if a global monetary crisis is triggered by what happens in Indonesia, Korea, and wherever else, and I can demonstrate to you point by point why that would be. You and I could both come up with more equitable, better ways to solve the problem.
Let me get back to my question, okay? And maybe somebody else wants to pick it up. Simple question. You have a corrupt, and if anyone disagrees with me, please tell me. You have a corrupt military authoritarian society whose leader is worth $16 billion, whose family is worth $30 billion, and whose cronies are worth another $30 billion. Now, among other things, let me take another twist on my question. Why don't we ask these guys to bail out their own country? I mean, why don't we say to Mr. Suharto, you want any help? Hey, you know, you're going to have to go into your gold or whatever you have. You take $15 or $20 billion out of your family wealth to bail out your country before you come to the taxpayers of this country. Anyone want to respond to that?
Their assets are illiquid. Indonesia is facing a liquidity crisis. Run on the banking system, capital flight, loss of confidence in the currency. What President Suharto and his family own are the toll roads. They have control over some factories. They also, until a week ago, controlled some small banks that have been seized in this IMF package and, in fact, are going to be shut down and will probably cost the ruling family a couple of $1 billion. So you're quite right. There's tremendous inequality. The fact is we just don't have a framework to use their resources to solve this liquidity problem. Let me also continue for a minute because you have grossly mischaracterized many aspects of Indonesia. There is no doubt this is an authoritarian
country. I'd like
country.
to hear this, Mr. Chairman. Please continue. I've grossly mischaracterized.
There's no doubt that Indonesia is an authoritarian political regime. There's no doubt there's great inequality of wealth. The fact you didn't mention is that 80% of the income is controlled by a very small Chinese minority, which has been far more successful as entrepreneurs in developing business in the modern period than the traditional so-called booming part of the population. But there's dozens of studies now available from the World Bank and academic institutions showing that since the economic modernization program began there in the late 1960s, after the passing of the first president, Mr. Sukarno, Indonesia has not just had a high rate of economic growth, but has had a very broad distribution of that income growth, that there has been a very significant increase in living standards, which, if it could be sustained for another generation, would make this the phrase would be among development economists, lower middle income country. Now that said, there are great imperfections, and I think all of us recognize that over the next 10 or 20 years, one of the major challenges will be to move from a family dictatorship, a sultan as it were, with Mr. Suharto, into some kind of effective democracy that has more accountability to the people. But as we know, given the history of Asia, going back 1,000 years, democracy is very rare in Asia. It's only in a few countries in the last quarter century, as a byproduct of economic growth, successful integration in the world economy, that we've seen any attempt or any success at having any form of democracy, even if it is imperfect. And
okay, so I guess the bottom line of what you're saying, Mr. Hale, is that you don't have any moral qualms about putting at risk billions of taxpayer dollars to bail out a corrupt billionaire military regime.
The answer is I have great qualms about that, but I don't think the issue has been specified correctly. The issue is, do we want to prevent an example of financial contagion from spreading throughout the world and causing instability in the world economy that would be quite disruptive to people in this country? Let me also add, I am a seventh-generation Vermonter, and I think you have grossly mischaracterized the economy of Vermont, which I know intimately. First, Vermont currently has an unemployment rate of 3%. It has been very successful in lowering unemployment, despite the fact that it does have some significant competitive disadvantages to nearby states because of its very high level of marginal income tax rates, which have been among the highest in the nation during the modern period.
Right.
There is no doubt that we do suffer in Vermont from various kinds of inequality.
Do you deny
because
that the
we have
Census Bureau just told us
we-
the family income has gone down by 7% over the last 2 years?
I have not had an opportunity to examine the data, so I cannot obviously rebut
Well,
it.
that's what the facts are, sir.
Well, the answer
And if
is...
you think that that's a good economy,
The answer
I
is,
see you're
I
on a
suspect
bad
that the data is exaggerating the problem. But I would just stress to you that this current economic environment in the United States is going to be far more conducive to reducing inequality and addressing our social problems than any of the economic environments I see elsewhere in the industrial world. I am a regular visitor to Europe and to other parts of the world, and what I see in a country like France and Germany, which tries to legislate equality through
And how much more do the
overregulation of the
workers in
workplace,
Germany make than the workers in the United States, sir?
is producing mass
The
unemployment
time of the gentleman is expired.
and is undermining the very, very forces you would like to nurture in this
Will
country.
the gentleman withhold? Mrs. Maloney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am